Hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining today's live stream. This is a Tuesday live stream we host every Tuesday at the same time, same place to talk about digital transformation and all things related to digital transformation, including the people, process, technology, and strategy sides of transformation. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach their third stage of digital transformation success. And today's topic that we're going to cover in today's stream is the biggest hoaxes in the digital technology and software industry. So we're going to talk about those things that are misleading in the industry, things that you should be aware of. And really our goal today is to really pull back the curtain of what happens behind the scenes of the digital transformation space so that you can make better informed decisions and execute better strategies in a way that kind of sees through some of these hoaxes. Before we get started, though, a couple quick logistical items. First of all, this live stream we host every Tuesday, as I mentioned, but the live production of this discussion actually becomes part of my weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast, which is released every Wednesday on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. It's also released on audio podcast platforms. So be sure to check out that podcast if you don't already. You can find that every Wednesday. New episode drops every week. Again, that's called Transformation Ground Control. So you're getting to be part of the live production of that podcast by being here today. So thank you very much for being here. Secondly, I'm going to take a bunch of audience questions and comments, or as many as I can, based on feedback you have. So I'd love to hear your comments as we get started in the discussion here today. Would love to hear from you, things you agree with, things you disagree with that we talk about here, and additional thoughts you might have as it relates to the topic here at hand. So be sure to drop that in the chat. I am watching the chat from all the streams here today on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So be sure to drop those at any point in the chat if you have questions. And speaking of the chat, if you could just drop in the chat right now what city and country you're joining from today. I always love to see where our global community is joining from. It's always exciting to interact every week with the global audience. So I appreciate you dropping in the chat where you're from today. So I mentioned at the top of the discussion here, today's topic is biggest hoaxes in the digital technology industry. And I'll apologize in advance for any offense I might cause to the industry or industry colleagues that are selling software or selling services. And my intent is not to offend anyone, but instead to pull back the veil of what happens in the digital transformation space, just to be more aware of what typically happens in these sorts of situations, and really to provide some counterpoints to what some of the common messaging is in the sales and marketing messaging within the technology space. And really, the reason I like this conversation, or I like this topic, is because it's one of those things where, especially in today's society, it's almost like it's a faux pas, or it's frowned upon to speak the truth or to talk about what's really happening behind the scenes, or what you really see on the front lines with organizations that are going through digital transformations. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today might be controversial. It might be counter to what you've heard from software vendors or from system integrators or even from industry analysts in this space. And my intent here is to really provide some counterpoints to the common refrain or the common sales and marketing messaging that you typically hear in the space. And the reason I like doing this too is because it's something that, it needs to be discussed. Whenever you have something that sounds too good to be true, or you have that silver bullet that is being sold to you as an organization, chances are it is too good to be true. And so it's really important to understand what the downside risks are of some of the common, widely accepted ways of doing things are in the industry. Whether it's talking about the merits of cloud technologies or the maturity of cloud technologies, whether it's talking about, industry analysis and things that you get from the industry, whether it's other types of sales and marketing messaging that you might get from software vendors. Really, the goal is to really not to be too skeptical, but you want to be somewhat skeptical. You want to be healthy. You want to be skeptical in a healthy way of what some of these sales and marketing messages are, because there typically is a counterpoint. There typically is a downside risk to any major decision you might make as an organization as it relates to your technology and digital transformation initiative. So really, I'm gonna dive into some of these concepts here, and again, as we're going through this, I would love to hear from the audience here some of the things that you've seen in terms of hoaxes or misleading sales statements that you hear from the industry, Or if you disagree that you don't think these things are misleading and you have a different thought, I'd love to hear that as well. So really hope to have a spirited debate here and a spirited discussion as we go through the conversation here. So what I'm going to do is I've got a sort of a starting point list of some of the things that grate my nerves, if you will. These are the things that are triggers for me as far as when I hear these things that I don't believe them to be true, or at best they're misleading. They're not 100% true, and there's a dark side to some of these statements. So that's what I've done is I've started a starting point here, and I'd love to hear everyone's feedback on this. And I'm just going to go through these in no real particular order. And again, as you have comments or if you think of things, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are as we get going here on this conversation. So just to start, I'm going to pick one industry hoax that has been around for a long time, and it's something that's extremely misleading, and it's something that, in my opinion, mismanages expectations for digital transformations. And it's one of these things that sounds really good. It's kind of what we want to hear when we buy technology or when we invest in technology, but it's something that if we believe too much in this, it's going to lead us down a path of really bad decisions, lost or misguided expectations, and it's not going to allow us to be effective. And that concept is industry best practices. That's one of the hoaxes that I feel like has been around for a long time. And it's, again, a really good sales message. Whoever thought of this term is brilliant. I'll give them credit for that, because it takes away, it's a concept that suggests that we can take away the risk of configuring and deploying a technology to meet our specific needs. And so if we think about best practices, what typically the way software vendors will sell or position industry best practices is they'll position it as something that provides sort of out-of-the-box capability, that provides industry processes that will allow you to start using the software right away. And there's a couple problems with that concept, although, again, on the surface, it sounds great, and it's sort of what we want to hear as humans and as decision makers. But the problem with that is twofold. One is that in any given industry, first of all, there are a lot of different variations on how you can do basic business processes. And in any given industry, we're all trying to compete. We're all trying to be better than our peers. We're trying to do something different. We're trying to grow our business in a way that develops competitive advantages and builds our core competencies in a way that's better than our competitors. So to suggest that there's industry best practices and that if you use our software or use software vendor A, B, or C to provide those best practices, that's misleading, because what's best practice to one organization is probably not best practice to another organization. And that's the first part. The second part is that if you really think about it, industry best practices, you have to think about who's to decide what best practices are. There's no universal global standard for what an industry best practice is for, say, chemical manufacturing. What industry best practices really are, in my opinion, is it's the way that software vendor has chosen to build their software for that industry. Doesn't mean it's best, doesn't mean it's bad either, but it doesn't mean it's best practice. It doesn't mean it's going to work for your business. And that's something to be aware of. And I think the challenging part here is that it leads you to think that if I deploy this software, I'm not going to have to go through the messiness and the hard work of rolling out my sleeves and defining what I want to be when I grow up and defining how I want the software to work, defining how I want to configure the software. All that stuff takes time and effort. And industry best practices is a concept that is meant to downplay or minimize that activity. And to me, again, that's very risky to believe in that, because it's just not true. You have to build the software in a way that supports your business. And again, there is no such thing as best practices. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. If you've heard this concept before, if you believe in it, do you believe that there is such a thing as industry best practices? Have you seen it work? Have you seen it backfire? I'd love to hear your thoughts here as it relates to best practices. I also want to turn to the audience too and thank those of you that have dropped in the chat where you're joining from today. We have Ryan from Denver, OT from, I'm not sure where OT's from actually. Renew from India. Thank you for being here so far, and thank you for dropping in the chat where you're joining from today. But again, I'd love to hear from the audience your thoughts and comments on what your thoughts are of industry best practices, or if you have any follow-up questions related to that. So that's something to be aware of, is when you hear industry best practices, which you probably will hear if you haven't already. If you're out shopping for software or evaluating potential software systems, chances are pretty high you're gonna hear this term. Now, one caveat I'll throw in here too, one last thing I'll mention about industry best practices before we move on, is that I think the exception to this would be if you're looking at a solution that is highly focused on, say, a certain industry vertical, or it's a solution that's focused on a certain functional vertical, like a human capital management system or a sales and CRM system, supply chain system, warehouse management, whatever the case may be, a best of breed focused solution like that, then this comment or this hoax is less of a problem, because chances are higher that that highly specialized or highly focused solution is going to actually have a number of, I still can't use the word best practices with a straight face, but something closer to best practices. Or at the very least, it has robust capability and a lot of depth and breadth within a certain area that gives you the flexibility to determine or to deploy a solution that fits your needs in your business and your specific area. So that is the one caveat I'll say, but certainly when you're looking at an enterprise-wide technology like an ERP system, and you hear the term industry best practices, you really want to call BS on that, because there is no such thing as industry best practices. And that gets into the whole debate too of, for example, if I'm looking at SAP, Oracle, and Microsoft, they all have best practices, but they're all totally different systems. So what is the best practice? And I think that sort of answers the question right there, is there are no best practices. It's just the way that the software was built and the way that that vendor thinks best practices should be. And then one last thing too is, a lot of times when you challenge industry best practices and you question, are these really best practices, or how do you know these are best practices? A lot of times it's met with sort of a dismissive response, like, you just need to be open to change. If you don't like our best practices, or you don't think these are actually best practices, it's not the software's fault, it's your fault, because you can't adapt to new technology. And that's certainly a problem as well, in my opinion, is when buyers go through that process, that's the last thing you want to hear, is that you're the problem, or that you're refusing to change. And you certainly want to be aware of resistance to change. That is a problem for digital transformations in general, but typically that's not the real problem when there's questions around best practices. So curious to hear your thoughts around best practices and what your thoughts are here. And then sort of along these same lines, I'm actually going to get to a comment here that's related to best practices. This is from William on YouTube. William says, feature exaggeration is common in SaaS land sales. Same with ease of use and implementation. So that's a great point. When you oftentimes are going to get an overly exaggerated view of software when you're getting demos or when you're talking to a software vendor. And if you think about it, that's their job. Their job is to highlight the strengths of their product and convince you that the product is worthy of your investment. And you can't fault anyone for doing that. That's their job. And I'm not faulting anyone for that. And I'm also not faulting anyone for really highlighting and focusing on the strengths of the product and the features and the abilities and that sort of thing. But again, I think the problem is probably unintentional, although in some cases it may be intentional depending on the type of salesperson that you're dealing with. But in most cases, I think it's unintentional, but it does create unrealistic expectations, and it creates a false sense of confidence in a certain product when you talk about industry best practices, or when you're talking about features and capabilities, which you'll often focus on during a software vendor. So that's a great point, William. Thank you for that. So I want to cover another topic here that is common, sort of a common hoax or problem in the industry in terms of how software is sold. And that is the concept, especially if you're looking at ERP systems. We were just talking about that a moment ago. When you're talking about ERP systems, another problem or another common hoax is the message that a single ERP system can address all of an organization's needs. And again, this gets back to the similar thread that we were just talking about with industry best practices here, with positioning ERP systems as the silver bullet to solve all of an organization's problems. Again, this is a sales rep's job. That's their job, is to convince you that you should use an enterprise-wide technology. And there typically are significant benefits to deploying ERP systems in general. There is an integrated, it is an integrated platform typically. Typically, it's one user interface and one system that people have to access now instead of multiple systems. You have a single source of truth with that ERP system. There's a lot of benefits. So I'm not suggesting that there isn't merit in implementing ERP systems or that there isn't business value in ERP systems. But where ERP systems become a problem is when you're convinced that it can handle all of your needs and you start to force fit it into areas of your organization that it doesn't belong. So just to give you a couple examples, a lot of times when we have clients who are implementing ERP systems are generally pretty good at financial and accounting, inventory management, customer service, order management, basic supply chain, warehouse management, sort of your core business processes, those vanilla business processes that are pretty common across industries and common across organizations. But where ERP systems get strained is when you start to look at sort of the edge of the organization. And by the edge of the organization, I don't mean parts of the business that aren't important. Quite the contrary. I'm suggesting these are edges of the organization that are either unique to a certain industry, unique to that business. It's a highly specialized business process. That's where you start to see problems, and some examples of where you commonly see challenges with ERP systems' ability to address business needs. One would be something like product lifecycle management, CRM, sales and sales automation and customer relationship management. Oftentimes ERP systems don't do CRM really well. They have CRM modules and they have PLM modules for product lifecycle management, but oftentimes those modules aren't as good as a specialized system that you might go out and buy and bolt onto a core ERP system. But again, of course, the sales rep's job is to convince you that you should use that core ERP system for all of your organization, even if it waters down some of the capabilities or some of the needs you have. And of course, that's a whole nother discussion, a whole nother point of debate or challenge. Is it better to have a single ERP system that ties everything together, that's easier to deploy, but doesn't give you the capabilities you need across the board? Or is it better to go find more of a best of breed or find those selective bolt-ons that give you better capabilities and maybe you're a better match for your business needs and potentially provide greater value, but now you've created integration issues and complexity that you have from an architecture perspective. And that's an age-old debate that only you can answer, and every organization typically will have different criteria they use to come to a consensus on what the right answer is for them. And there is no right or wrong answer. I mean, I can debate both sides of that equation or that debate all day. But the key, though, is to understand that chances are pretty high that if you're deploying a single ERP system, you're going to be leaving functionality and capabilities on the table, and you're probably not going to get what you want across the board. You might get 70 or 80% of what you want, but then the question becomes, and the controversy centers on that 10 to 20 to 30% of the organization that can't effectively be addressed by that core ERP system, which then, by the way, leads to organizational change, resistance, and other issues during implementation. Not the end of the world, not something you can't deal with, but that is a challenge that comes along with that. So I think it's just a matter of, again, seeing through the sales messaging of the feeling or creating the feeling that you have to have one ERP system. And if you don't have one ERP system, you're just creating a mess. Now you don't have a single source of truth. Now you've created all this complexity. Yes, you have. That is true. But if it creates enough business value to justify that risk and to justify that potential downside, then it's absolutely potentially worth it. So I think you just have to look at, what your needs are and what specific systems you might be looking at in general. So that's something to be aware of too. I want to get to some comments that are coming in on the stream here. Here's a comment from Mike on LinkedIn. Has an interesting comment here. The size of the business and the business process maturity are critical. Business running on Excel and Google Sheets need the best practices. They need the functionality and follow these standard business processes, especially in financials and warehouse you just mentioned. So it sounds like you're saying that if you're on, say, a really immature system, whether it be Microsoft Excel, Google Sheets, or maybe it's an old ERP system, mainframe system from 20 or 30 years ago, whatever the case may be. Let's say you're on really old technologies and there's a big jump between where you are today and where you could be if you had better technologies. I think there is something to be said about quote unquote best practices that get introduced to the organization as a result. And I think software can introduce potential process improvements. So I think this is a really good discussion or a good point of clarification. I think obviously technology is the intent, and the whole reason we we deploy technologies is to improve our business processes. So I do agree with that. Technology should and could absolutely deliver business process improvements, but I think that the delineation I would call out is that process improvement is different than best practices. Best practices suggest that there's some universal answer to what the best process is for any given workflow or function, and that's just simply not true. Now, it may be true to more so for really vanilla processes. So you think about something that's a vanilla common process and it's not a core differentiator or a competitive advantage to you as an organization. And a real maybe extreme example would be something like accounts payable. Most organizations aren't competitive or better than their peers because they pay their invoices faster. That's typically not a core competitive advantage that organizations are striving for, but it's something that you can typically adapt a little bit easier to whatever the software can and can't do. Accounts payable might be a good example of an area where you're more willing to compromise or to change to fit the software because it's not a core part of your business or it's not a core competitive advantage. But if you're talking about something more customer facing or something that is involving your product, the way you configure your product, the way you manufacture the product, the cost advantage you might have related to your manufacturing, for example, those are areas where best practices are probably not going to fit, and it's going to strain the concept of best practices. So I think, it's important to differentiate between business process improvements and where maybe some light best practices might be relevant or more relevant versus those parts of your business that you really want your unique needs to be front and center, and you need to find the technology and make the technology fit your business rather than assuming you're just going to change your business to fit the software. So different parts of your business might have different answers too. There's usually not one answer for an entire organization. You have to be a little bit more targeted in how you approach that. So that's a great point that you bring up here. So here's a comment from Kyler on LinkedIn who says, similar to the conversation from last week, and I honestly don't remember what the conversation was last week, but on this, we do this live stream every week. Last week, we talked about something related to this, apparently. I think it's important to remember that the organization must know their needs, not the needs that the vendor wants you to have. It's a great point. And it's certainly a balancing act where, yes, you want to look to technology and the capabilities of technologies to give you ideas on how you might improve your processes. But again, there's certain parts of your business that are probably high value. They're probably very mature. They're probably very fine-tuned, and you've developed these parts of your business over decades of building that competitive advantage to now say, okay, we're going to abandon that and just go with best practices or go with the way the software is built. That's a highly destructive and dangerous way of approaching digital transformation. And again, there are certain parts of your business where that may be relevant, where you may say, yes, we're just going to compromise and adapt to whatever the software can do in these areas. But these areas over here, these are too important. These are areas we don't want to touch. This is our secret sauce. This is what we've spent decades building in terms of competencies. We need the software to adapt to that. So I think it's really important to prioritize your processes and have a good self-awareness of what the most important parts of your business are. Here's another interesting comment from Mike on LinkedIn. Mike says the ERP/CRM should sit in the center. Those functionalities need to be filled with low-code, no-code tools. I am a Microsoft Dynamics person, so the Power Platform fills this gap completely. It's well said. I think that's a common, whether you're using the Microsoft platform or other platforms, by the way. I think recognizing that you have a lot of options in how you mix and match and pull together different technologies to fit your needs. ERP, I agree. ERP is great for kind of your core back office functions, the financial management, accounting, GL, inventory management, order management, that sort of stuff. ERP is generally really good at. It's really, I think the way to look at it is when you look at your organization, what industry you're in, you think about, one thing to think about is how are business processes different in our industry? And those are more likely to strain or create tension with what a core ERP system can do if you're looking at an enterprise-wide system. Here's a really interesting comment from YouTube. This is from Rufus on YouTube. And Rufus says, "Good day, dear sir." Good day to you too, dear sir. I run a small digital transformation consulting firm. an SAP product implementation, among others. And I do think the advances in AI will spell the doom of ERP. The question is just when. Really interesting comment. I'd love to hear I'd love to hear more about that. Why you think or how you think AI will spell the end of ERP, because that's actually something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Is how will AI and how will ChatGPT and some of these other booming technologies, how will they affect ERP technology services like what we do at Third Stage Consulting? I've been just dwelling on that stuff a lot lately. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you think AI will spell the doom of ERP, or if you disagree with Rufus, I'd love to hear your counterpoints as well. So, and Kyler just reminded me of last week's live stream topic. If you missed last week, I talked about clients' rights and responsibilities. Now I remember that. That is indeed what we talked about. So thank you, Kyler, for keeping me on track here. And Kyler's included a link. If you're on LinkedIn, she's included a link to that video from last week's live stream. So want to get to another one here. Thank you for all the comments, by the way. These are really interesting and good ones. I'm going to get to one that I'm pretty sure is going to trigger at least one person listening and watching. I don't know who it is, but at least one person will highly likely be triggered by this. And that is, cloud is cheaper than on-premises systems. This is one that really bothers me, and it's one that I debate often in the industry because this is probably the most controversial topic, or the one that I debate the most. And I think this is probably the one comment or belief I have that irritates the vendor community more than anything else I say or do, which there's plenty of things I say and do that irritate the vendor community at times. But this is probably the biggest one, and that is this concept or the sales message that if you deploy cloud solutions, it's cheaper than on-premises systems. And I'll start by saying, yes, that's true, but that's the way I'd sort of start the answer. I'd say, yes, it's true at first. Your initial costs are generally cheaper, not implementation costs. I highly disagree that implementation costs of cloud solutions are cheaper, because they're typically not. What typically ends up happening is, yes, the software itself is easier to access because you don't have to install it on servers. You don't have to manage it within your four walls of your IT department. But implementing and deploying technology, a majority of the heavy lifting and the work and the heartburn and the risk and the cost and the resource commitment comes from not the technology deployment. It's from your process improvement, from the change management, from getting business value out of the technology and just adapting to the software. That stuff isn't any better or any more automated because you're deploying cloud technology. In fact, I would argue that the amount of time that's saved on the technological side of having a cloud solution that is easier to deploy purely from a technological perspective, that benefit is outweighed by the fact that it's harder for organizations to adapt to cloud solutions typically, because you typically have less flexibility. Now, of course, I'm talking more about SaaS and multi-tenant cloud solutions, those subscription-based models where you can't customize the software to fit your needs. You can configure it, but you can't customize it. That just makes change management more difficult, and it makes the adoption to the new software more difficult. So I'd say it's at best a wash. The amount of time and money you save on deploying the technology may be a little bit faster, but that's going to be countered by the fact that the organization's adoption of that cloud technology is going to be more difficult. It might absolutely deliver more business value long-term. I'm not talking about business value here. I'm talking about pure cost. So if I look at cost, even when I factor in the servers that I don't have to invest in anymore, the IT staff that I might not need to maintain, yes, there's going to be some savings there, but typically that savings is outweighed by the fact that now you're paying a higher ongoing subscription cost. So those subscription costs make it easier to get into the new software. So you don't have that big capital spend like you might have had in the past with the old on-premises model. But now with cloud solutions, yes, you have a lower entry point, but now you've got an ongoing subscription that never goes away. It's sort of like, it reminds me a lot of leasing versus buying a car. When you buy a car, you're spending more money up front, but eventually your payment goes away. If you're financing it, your payment's going to go away after 5 years or whatever it is. When you lease a car, you're just always going to have that payment. The lease payment's lower, but it goes on into perpetuity. And the other part of this too that you have to remember is, where does this message come from? The cloud is cheaper, and why are vendors so interested in cloud? Why do they push it so hard? I would argue that it's not because cloud technology is any better, although there are definite advantages to cloud systems. There's the ongoing R&D, the upgrades are easier. You're getting, immediate, bleeding edge technologies that keep you at the forefront of technology. So there are absolutely benefits to that. But if you think about where the messaging is coming from, it's coming from the fact that cloud subscription-based models are highly valued by technology companies and highly valued by investors. So investors that invest in SAP and Oracle and Microsoft, if you read their annual reports and you read the analysis of any sort of quarterly earnings report that comes from a software vendor, they are hyper-focused on that recurring subscription revenue, because that's a lot more value to an investor than the on-premises model, where it's a one-time purchase and the vendor has to go out and continuously find new business to replace that revenue. Yes, they used to have like the ongoing maintenance. They would have their 15 or 20% of subscription that would be the ongoing maintenance, but that's not nearly as attractive or lucrative as that recurring subscription cost that goes into perpetuity. So investors love it, vendors love it. They push it really hard as the best option and the only option for organizations. And therefore you get misleading messages like this, like you should be going to the cloud because you're going to save money. You're really not. There are going to be some areas of cost savings, but there's going to be other areas that offset that. In fact, in some cases, we see even the IT cost savings isn't as great as advertised, in that you don't end up getting rid of staff to support a system. Now you end up hiring people because the system is more complex and there's more robust capabilities. And again, it could be that it's delivering more business value and the ROI makes total sense. I'm not disputing that, because I think more organizations than not have a lot of potential to invest in cloud systems and get a really good ROI. But the problem is they go in thinking that they're going to save money when they're not. They're not really saving money. They're investing money. They're spending more money. They're shifting their spend from internal IT costs over to a managed service provider. So the costs are just shifting. You're not really saving money. And the idea or the goal is that you get enough business value or business benefits that justify that additional cost. That's more the question that you really need to focus on with cloud versus on-premises solutions. So here's a follow-on I want to come back to on the AI causing the death of ERP systems, from Rufus again on YouTube. And I think this is an interesting thing to dive into for a second. Rufus says one could train a GPT-like model to handle classic data in, data out operations typically handled by ERPs. ERPs allow us to tap into the company's data capital. AI models allow you to talk to it. So that's a really interesting point or comment. In fact, this is something we were talking about just internally. I was talking about this with our team in the UK yesterday around ChatGPT and how that's affecting confidentiality of organizations that are going through implementations, or they're implementing technologies. And what they were saying, or what the team was talking about, was how there's certain consultants out there that are implementing, I think in this case, they were talking about SAP. They were implementing SAP, and they were putting information from SAP into ChatGPT. And what it was doing is it was making public domain, it was making confidential information, internal company information, it was making it public domain, because now it's part of ChatGPT and it's in that open source model that anyone can access. So I thought that was a really interesting point, in that there's some confidentiality and data security issues with ChatGPT and other potential AI, especially the open source AI models. So I'd be curious to see over time if that somehow resolves itself, or how organizations deal with the confidentiality. I think in order for this trend to materialize that you mentioned with AI killing off ERP, I think you're going to have to somehow resolve that confidentiality issue, both in terms of the companies that are implementing technologies, but even the software vendors themselves. I imagine they're going to push back pretty hard, or somehow find a way to protect their IP and whatnot. So really interesting. I don't have any good answers or predictions for that. But that's a really interesting debate or point of discussion. Here's a comment from YouTube, and the comment is, "Thank you for highlighting the importance of business process design and improvement. I've yet to see enough advances in this area, even having a centralized repository of user-friendly processes." Great point. And I think if you step back and look at most organizations, maybe with the exception of the public sector and nonprofit sector, but other than the public sector, I'd say most organizations are focused on creating competitive advantage. How do they create those differentiators? How do they create processes that allow them to win, to compete better, that sort of thing? That runs totally counter to this idea of industry best practices that everyone's going to use. If everyone in one industry followed the same processes, used the same technologies, you wouldn't have a competitive advantage. So it's a natural tension that you're going to have where organizations want to be different. They want to create that competitive advantage and push it even further. So I agree. The business process improvement is an area that's often underrated, and the concept of industry best practices totally waters down and undermines the value of business process improvement because it makes you think that you don't need to do business process improvement and you don't need to be deliberate about it because you just use the software and the best practices, and that is your business process improvement. And that's highly just wrong. It doesn't work, except for those rare instances where you've got a vanilla process that's low value, relatively speaking, low value to the competitive advantage of the organization. In those cases, then maybe, but most of the rest of the organization, you're not going to get the process improvements you want if you just rely on best practices to be your guide. I want to get to a really good hoax that was not on my list, but Kyler brings it up here. It's an awesome one, and I should have thought of this one actually. And that is, you have to move to a new system if your legacy solution is being sunset. And this is a great one. In fact, this is one of the most unhealthy things and the most unethical things I've ever seen in my career. And sometimes I still can't believe it's happening, but that is that you get software vendors that have provided you a certain software for however many years or decades. And let's use Microsoft as an example. They have Microsoft Great Plains as an example. Great Plains I'm not here to dispute or debate whether or not Great Plains is a good system or ever was a good system. But organizations that are on Great Plains have recently been told that they have to get off that system. And they need to upgrade to presumably D365, which is the current cloud version of Microsoft's ERP system. And it's not just Microsoft. SAP's doing the same thing with ECC. They're sunsetting that product and saying, we're not going to support it after whatever date. I think it's 2027. And at that point, you need to be on S4HANA, SAP S4HANA, in order to get support. If you think about it, it's highly, even though I suppose vendors have a right to do this, they're a legal right, I should say, you have to question the ethics of that. Organization like SAP or Microsoft that essentially are holding you hostage because you have your entire operations running on their system. All your data is in there. You rely on that technology to run your business day to day, and they're essentially forcing you to rip that out and replace it, or at least that's the perception they're creating. And so we get a lot of calls from clients. A lot of clients that contact us at Third Stage are in sort of a panic. They know they're looking down the barrel of a deadline and time's working against them because they know the product's going to be sunset. There's not going to be support. And I guess, a couple things to the point here that Kyler makes is that when a vendor says that they're going to sunset a product, it's not the end of the world. Now, it's not ideal at all. I'm not suggesting just ignore it, but just because, let's just say they say by 2027, no longer supporting that system. If you're using that system until 2028 or 2029 in some way, that's not the end of the world. Yeah, they're not going to support it. Yes, it's going to make things more difficult for you. But you have to look at the risk profile of that scenario versus the risk profile of rushing to re-implement a new system when you don't have the time or the resources or the budget or whatever. That risk could actually be greater than just staying on the system or being a little bit more measured in how you go through your implementation. So a lot of times, we have to advise our clients to just take a deep breath and slow down, because not that you want to just ignore it, not that you want to move at a snail's pace, of course, but you don't need to rush, just jump straight off a cliff because a vendor tells you you've got to get off their system. So I think you just have to be aware of that. Yes, you want a strategy long-term to navigate that. Personally, if I'm dealing with a vendor that tells me that I have to get off their system and I've got X amount of time to do it and I have to move to the cloud, I question the relationship with that vendor if that's the vendor I really want longer term. But that's me, and I know organizations are more complex than one decision maker like me, so that's something to keep in mind as well. So that's a great point. You don't have to move off your legacy product just because the vendor tells you that you have to. Another one that I'll kind of throw in that's semi-related to this, I almost added it to my list, but I didn't feel like it was worthy of an entire thread, but I'll sort of just add it to this one instead. That is the concept of technical debt. That's a phrase that's a trigger for me. It sort of grates my nerves. It's like nails on a chalkboard when I hear the word technical debt, because it's another manufactured term that's highly effective, brilliant term. Whoever thought of it, kudos to you for thinking of a great marketing term. But what it does is suggest to you that you're in debt and you have to get out of debt. If you think about the human reaction to the word debt, you think debt's bad, I need to get out of debt. So technical debt suggests that whatever system I'm on, even if it's just a couple years old or whether it's 20 or 30 years old, I'm in debt. I need to get out of it. I need to upgrade to something new. The reason I bring this up is that you don't have to be on the newest and greatest bleeding edge technologies. In fact, there's a lot of merit of not being on the bleeding edge. We have one big client that has intentionally chosen to stay on Oracle EBS, for example. They're in the middle of a massive multi-year Oracle EBS implementation. Oracle tried to force them mid-implementation to move to Oracle Fusion Cloud or Oracle ERP Cloud, wherever they're calling it today. And they chose not to. They said, no, there's too much missing in the capabilities of the new cloud solution. We're going to stick with the older technology, knowing that it's older, knowing that we're going to have to replace it sooner, but knowing that it's mature, it handles our needs, and it's a better fit for our organization. So another great example of a client taking charge and doing what they need to do to run their business. And this is a very unique client, by the way. They are very self-aware. They're very confident. They don't fall victim to all this stuff I'm talking about here today. In fact, none of this would interest them. If they were on this call, they would say none of this phases us because we know it's all BS and we're not going to fall for it. That's the sort of organization they are. So those are just a couple examples of how you want to be aware of that hoax, that hoax that you need to be off your old system, whether it's because you're in technical debt or because you're being told by your vendor that the software is being sunset. Wait, a lot of comments here. I apologize for the radio silence here. Oh, here's an interesting point from William again on YouTube. He says a host of services companies are actively advertising that they will support SAP tech after sunset regarding S/4HANA. Great point. Actually, I'm glad you said this because it further validates or further justifies the point I made before that we were just talking about with sunsetting products. That is another option, and that's something that there's a lot of tech companies that have built their entire business around providing third-party support. So companies like Rimini Street, I think it's called. There's another one called Spinnaker Support that's actually based here in Denver, where Third Stage Consulting is based, and where I'm based. Those are just two examples of third-party support organizations that provide at a lower cost support for some of these legacy products. And it's a great business model because you're always going to have these lagging organizations that are slower to move to newer technologies. But the good news is it creates an option for you. It gives you additional time. It gives you additional runway and breathing room if you do decide that you are going to take longer to deploy. Because if you think about it, these are artificial dates that the vendors have created. They just decided we don't want to invest any more R&D in these solutions. We want to put all our eggs in one basket of the newer product, which makes total sense from a business perspective from their side. But that doesn't mean that you need to pay the price and you need to be on that same page. You need to do what's best for your business. And if that decision is to stay on the system for longer, then third-party support options are certainly ones that you can look for, especially if you're using SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, Infor. Any of these bigger, well-known brands are going to have third-party support options that might allow you to continue to stay on those systems if needed. And again, you compare that cost to the cost and risk of moving potentially prematurely to a new system, and you might find that that's worth it. You may also find that it's not too, by the way. There's going to be organizations where that just doesn't make sense, and they should be on the newer system, in which case that's okay too. It just depends on your needs here. So I want to get to one other one that's semi-related to what we were just talking about, and that is, I was starting to talk about this with the client that was implementing Oracle EBS. Oracle tried to convince them to go to Oracle Cloud ERP. Client decides no, we're sticking with EBS. Reason for that is it leads to this other hoax, which is that cloud systems are mature and scalable. Highly misleading comments that you'll see and hear in the industry, with the exception of this comment, by the way, does not apply to native cloud solutions. So NetSuite, Salesforce, Workday, for example, those are three products that were built in the cloud. They've been in the cloud for 20 plus years. So their products are different. They've invested all the R&D dollars they've invested over decades are in that current solution that's already in the cloud. With other vendors like SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, Infor, Epicor, insert vendor name here, for most other software vendors that were built on premise with their initial systems, they've had to rewrite these systems to create entirely new versions of the software, and you simply can't rewrite that stuff overnight. If it took you 30 years of building capabilities on premises, you're not going to suddenly in just 3 or 5 or 7 years convert all that over into a cloud solution. Now, the vendors are getting closer, but there's still a lot of non-core ERP capabilities that are not mature and they're not ready for prime time. And that's where a lot of companies get into trouble is, for example, SAP customers. SAP is having massive problems with this, where you have companies that are used to SAP ECC. They know what ECC can do, and they assume that S4HANA can do the same thing or maybe even better. And while S4HANA is introducing new capabilities that ECC did not have, there's some core basic functionality that S4HANA can't do that ECC could, not because they don't want S4HANA to do it, but just because they haven't developed it fully yet. So we've just seen that too many times with SAP and other vendors too, where there's a misleading expectation or a faulty expectation that the cloud solution is going to be just as good, or if not better, than the old legacy system. And again, while there's merits to these cloud systems, you have to recognize that there's downsides too, and that there's gaps there. So that's something to be aware of, is that these newer cloud systems are not yet mature to the extent that on-premises systems were. I hope that this comment is obsolete very soon, within the next couple of years. But as of right now, as we sit here in 2023, that maturity is not there yet, and which leads to scalability issues. When you've got a cloud system that can't handle your needs and your capabilities, that actually undermines the scalability of the software. But yet cloud systems are sold as a more scalable solution than on premises. So that's something to be aware of as well. And then related to that, from LinkedIn, and I apologize, I can't see the name of the person that asked this, but this is from LinkedIn. Any thoughts why people choose to move to SAP S4HANA? Well, partially because SAP is forcing a lot of their ECC customers off of ECC. That's driving a lot of S4HANA sales. Highly effective way to drive revenue, by the way. If you're a software vendor, just tell the lower margin on-premises customers that they have to stop using that software and they have to upgrade. Even if you lose a few customers along the way, you're still coming out way ahead, because you're going to have so many customers that now are going to invest in the cloud solution. You're going to make more money even if you lose some of the customers to a competitor, which rarely happens if you think about it. It's pretty rare that we see a customer going from, for example, SAP ECC to Oracle Cloud or Microsoft Dynamics. I know Oracle and Microsoft would love to see more of that, and as would other vendors that are competing for the same piece of the pie, but it's pretty rare. So I think it's a calculated gamble by vendors that you're going to do it. So I think a big reason why customers move to S4HANA is because SAP is forcing them. And, it is a newer, sexier solution. It has a lot of cool machine learning and AI type stuff in there that ECC didn't have or doesn't have. So there are potential upside benefits. And I think over time, it's going to be obvious that S4HANA is a better solution than ECC, but it's just not. We haven't quite crossed that point yet. It's a great point. So here's a question from Kuba in Poland. Thank you for joining all the way from Poland in the evening your time. Thank you for being here. Kuba's question is, any takes on production-specific systems like MES or APS? Is AI being implemented into those areas? Greetings from Poland. So, yes. So AI is being used more and more for production-specific systems, but I'd say, to your point, it's being more in the context of those industry-specific solutions. So MES, for example, stands for manufacturing execution systems. Those are the systems that automate the shop floor. It's more the shop floor automation and the machine learning and gathering data from robotics and different parts of the shop floor operations. That massive volume of data and that highly focused technology is ripe for AI. That's where AI really shines right now. With ERP systems, yes, AI is being introduced, but it's more of the real basic parts of the business. For example, like PO processing, you're getting AI and machine learning to figure out, how to automate accounts payable processing and to kick out the exceptions to a human to take action or to intervene. So you are seeing AI in ERP systems, but you're not seeing AI in ERP systems around some of those really high value areas or higher value areas like manufacturing with MES. So I think, yes, you are seeing it, but I think you have to go with a to your point, a production specific or a functional specific software to really get, some groundbreaking AI at this point. That'll, become less true over time, but that's the way we see most of the industry right now. So here's another comment from Rufus. I recently convinced a client to switch away from cloud to an on-premise because the support from the hosting provider wasn't up to specs. The ERP in question is Sage, which is not a cloud native solution. So great point. I mean, you may find that the on-premise solution is a better fit, gives you more capability. In that case, you've got to go with it and figure out, what you're going to do to manage the downside risk of the fact that you're using an older system. There may be more limited support. Yes, that's a risk. It's a cost you have to factor in. But again, if it's delivering enough business value, that might be justified. And you really have to look at the risk reward and the cost benefit of that scenario versus others where you, where you might not be able to justify investing in a more expensive technology. So here's another hoax that's worth talking about here. And this is a really common one, and that is our system can be deployed in X number of months. Insert number here. We sometimes get proposals that are just completely bizarre and unrealistic, in terms of what a vendor is suggesting the technology can be deployed. If I had to pick on one vendor that's the most guilty of this, most consistently, I'd say it's NetSuite. NetSuite, for as good of a product as it is, they really mislead customers in terms of how long it's going to take to deploy. In general, it doesn't always happen, but that is a more common system that leads to faulty expectations. And they have this concept of suite success, which is a implementation methodology that they assure you can deploy the system in, oftentimes 90 days or less. And for a small, really simple organization, that might be somewhat achievable. But if you're a mid-size or even a large organization, you're just not going to deploy NetSuite in that amount of time. And I'm picking on NetSuite to some degree, but this is a universal problem with other vendors too, where the system integrator or the software sales rep or both come in and say, we can deploy this technology in 12 months or 18 months, whatever it is. And typically, whatever number you're given is really low, and it's too low. The reason being is that they're selling you a concept of how to deploy technology, which is different than going through a digital transformation and changing the way you do business and actually adopting and using the technology. Those are two totally different paths. Yes, you can deploy technology as fast as you want. I don't disagree with NetSuite, Suite Success, or any other vendor that says they can deploy technology in whatever amount of time. Chances are pretty high they could, but it's not going to be pretty, and it's not going to fit your needs, and it's not going to get used by your organization. It's not going to improve your business. It's not going to deliver business value. So it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you're really trying to get business value and an ROI, which I would argue most organizations are or should, then you should be making sure you add some reality and add a grain of salt to that proposal that you get from a technology provider, because the technology provider is going to underestimate, not because they are intentionally misleading, but because their job is to give you sort of a best case scenario. And the last thing they want to do is create an expectation that it's going to take more time, more money than a competitor. So they're trying to sell you on the merits of their software and how quickly it can be deployed and how easy it is to use. And with that comes expectations that get misstated. And so you really have to look at every proposal just to back up, every proposal we see from vendors that we're helping clients evaluate and negotiate with vendors. I can't remember the last time I saw one that looked at all realistic. I mean, most of the time, those proposals are completely understated, again, because they're focused on deploying technology, which is just one work stream within a digital transformation. When you talk about business process improvement, defining what you want to be when you grow up, redesigning your organization, defining your standardized business processes that you want to conform to across a global organization. Those are the things that take a lot of time. And that's what slows down a project. It's not the technology typically that slows it down, although it can. It's typically not the designing and building of the software that creates problems. It's all the other stuff. So it's all the other stuff you have to factor into your overall transformation plan to have a more realistic one. And then while I'm at it, I'll cover one other one that's really important, is that nobody ever got fired for hiring, insert big well-known name here. It could be SAP, it could be Accenture, it could be Deloitte, IBM, PwC, any of the big name software vendors and system integrators. There's a perception that it's safe. It's a safe bet to invest in or hire one of these big name vendors. And I'm so fascinated by this concept because I hear people say it fairly frequently that nobody ever got fired for choosing SAP. Nobody ever got fired for hiring Accenture. The problem with that is I can name a lot of people that have been fired. I've seen a lot of people lose their careers or get fired because they brought in SAP, they brought in Accenture, they brought in Deloitte, thinking that was the silver bullet they were looking for. But I would argue that those options are just as risky and sometimes even riskier than a lesser known name where, you think about a smaller vendor, a smaller software vendor, or a smaller implementer, they have more to lose if they piss off a client or irritate a client or don't do a good job. They have more to lose to have a dissatisfied customer than a big name does. So sometimes those smaller mid-tier vendors try harder and they provide better service and better value than a big name that's going to be super expensive and may or may not deliver business value. So, and I say that as a former PwC or an ex-PwC consultant. I mean, I saw how much customers were spending on us, and quite frankly, we as an organization didn't care necessarily if someone got fired for hiring us, as long as we kept that company as a client. That's what we really cared about. So, so I wouldn't be, that's something else to be aware of too, is people do absolutely get fired for hiring some of the big names. I've just seen too many failures and lawsuits in my time and too many terminated CIOs and CFOs, and even in some cases CEOs get fired for disasters that happen with their tech deployment. So I definitely wouldn't be misled by that comment either. So I'll take a couple more questions here as we go through this. Here's an interesting comment, just to sort of continue to pull back the curtain of the industry and the inner workings of the industry. This is from Manikandan on LinkedIn. Manikandan says, as SAP services partners, you earn services revenue quicker as the cloud solutions are fit to standard, unlike the classical implementation methodology of business blueprinting, customization, testing, user acceptance testing, and training. It's a great point. That's actually a really good, clear point and very straightforward to the point comment. And that is that, the economic incentive that vendors have and the service providers have is pro cloud, because the vendors obviously generate revenue faster because the subscription model kicks in right away and you're starting that meter running, and that goes on into perpetuity as long as you're using the software. So vendors love it. Service partners, yes, you get revenue quicker on the services side because you are typically trying to implement faster. And that kind of goes with the whole agile thing too, which is another hoax that we didn't get to here today. But agile methodologies are a way to speed things up. But in my opinion, agile often leads to reckless acceleration of an implementation or transformation. But it helps the service providers because they can bill more time and money sooner. And then also a lot of these service providers too, perhaps more importantly and more significantly, is they're making money or commission on the subscription revenue. So a lot of these service providers aren't just banking on providing you the services, they're banking on the fact that now they get a cut of this ongoing revenue into perpetuity. And usually, I don't think they typically get paid commission into perpetuity, but they usually get paid for like 3 or 5 years for that subscription for the lifetime of that, for that client. So they're making a lot of money on both sides. They're accelerating revenue on both sides, both the services side and the software side, which is, money talks. Money is very powerful, and money leads to some of the hoaxes that we're talking about here today. And that's, by the way, why we started Third Stage as an independent consulting firm, because we saw that economic self-interest was leading to such poor behavior and such damaging, destructive behavior in organizations. And quite frankly, it's why there's so many failures in the digital transformation space. And it's why so many of these implementations fail, is because expectations have been mismanaged because of economic self-interest on the part of software vendors and system integrators. So having an independent technology agnostic advisor like Third Stage is a way to counter that and have someone that's really representing you and only making money from you, paying them to give them advice rather than making money from the software vendors. So here's a comment from Brandon on YouTube. Says, we completely ignore the other stuff. Drives me crazy. LOL. Drives me crazy as well. So thank you for, I'm glad I'm not the only one, Brandon. So thank you for your comment here. A lot of really good points here. And then maybe a good place to close it here, since we're out of time, from William on YouTube, provides the greatest hoax of all, which is the main hoax is Bigfoot is alive and well and lives in Colorado. You're welcome. So William is based in Colorado, where I am as well, and that's where Third Stage is based. We have offices in other countries, in Europe, Africa, and Asia Pacific, but we are based globally here in Colorado. So Bigfoot's alive and well. That's the last hoax I'll share with you here today, courtesy of William on YouTube. So thank you for that. And thank you everyone for being here today. Really appreciate the comments. Continue to comment here, because we actually watched the stream and the comments in the post after the fact. So I'd love to see what comments you have, anything that we covered here that you disagree with, or you agree or seen in a different perspective, or do you have a different counterpoint? We'd love to hear your feedback. So thank you again for joining. This will be part of our Transformation Ground Control podcast episode that gets released a week from tomorrow. So be sure to check that out. And if you don't subscribe to Transformation Ground Control, you can watch it stream on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter every Wednesday morning U.S. time. And or you can subscribe to it on audio podcast platforms like Spotify, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Amazon, Pandora, iHeartRadio. Wherever you listen to podcasts, we're there. So be sure to subscribe to Transformation Ground Control. We'll take this live interview, we'll polish it up, edit it, add more content to it, and put out a full episode. And that full episode will come out a week from tomorrow. So thank you for being here. Every Tuesday, we do these live discussions to become part of that Transformation Ground Control. So you can find us at the same time, same place every Tuesday. So thank you for being here, and hope you all have a great week, and we will see you next time.